Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha TV. You're watching India's World with me, Aishwarya Kapoor. Today we'll look at the efforts for peace in Afghanistan. Now, there have been signs that logjam over entering peace talks with the Taliban could be easing. The Afghan government has named a council of senior political leaders who will appoint negotiators and create their mandate for talks and oversee their work. Now, the formation of this council comes after months of bitter disagreements over the next peace talk steps with the Taliban. And in the next half an hour, we will look at how significant this step is going to be as far as peace in Afghanistan is concerned and what could be the challenges and also, of course, the way ahead. Well, to discuss the issue, we have with us a panel of experts joining me on the program today. I'm joined by Mr. Tilak Deveshar, former Special Secretary, Cabinet Secretariat. I'm also joined in by Mr. Shakti Sinha, Strategic Affairs expert. We are also joined in by Mr. Vivek Kaju, former ambassador. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining me on the program today. Okay, let me start with the Ambassador Kaju. Sir, how do you look at this step towards achieving peace in Afghanistan, this formation of a council headed by President Ashraf Ghani? It is comprised of both the former and current senior government officials, leader of the other political parties and opposition groups as well. How important this step is going to be as far as peace process in Afghanistan is concerned?
This is a significant step because intra-Afghan talks have to be held, including with the Taliban, to resolve the issue of peacemaking in the country. However, this step is a good step, but not a sufficient step, because the road to peace is going to be a very long and thorny road. As of now, the Taliban have shown no inclination that they are willing to sit down with the government or any body which is constituted by the government and controlled by it. They are first of all wanting to have negotiations, which of course they are having with the Americans. They want to decide the full contours of a peace deal with the Americans. And thereafter, I get the feeling that they want to discuss with other Afghan groups, but not groups that are controlled by the government. So we'll have to wait and watch what will be the exact nature of the Taliban response. The Ashraf Ghani government has shown some flexibility because the way they have composed these groups, but we are not sure that the Taliban will even agree to this.
Absolutely. They have not mentioned whether they are agreed to these talks or not. They have not mentioned anything. Mr. Sinha, if I can come to you, because, you know, so far, as Ambassador Kaju was telling us, that so far the negotiations have occurred only between the insurgents and, of course, the American diplomats, and without, of course, the Afghan government really taking part in it. And, you know, CEO Abdullah had last month said the Taliban is actually an obstacle in the path of reaching process, even saying that the formation of negotiating team can prevent the Taliban from making an excuse really to avoid talks. In this backdrop, do you think that this new development will actually pressurize the Taliban to come to the table and have talks?
Not yet. In fact, only I think earlier today or late evening yesterday, they have issued a statement that they are convening an inter-Afghan dialogue in Qatar, where individual Afghans and groups can attend. Persons in the government can attend, but as an individual only, not as representing the government. So as of now, the Taliban stand is that the government of Afghanistan, whom they call a puppet regime, does not exist. So while as Ambassador Kaju is so right that the government and the other actors in the political space, in the legal political space, must get their act together to confront it. As of now, the Taliban are content just to be talking with the Americans. And the Americans have also added the fact that at a later stage, there would be an intra-Afghan dialogue, which would include the government. So in that sense, both the Taliban and Americans today are not really stressing as much as the government as we would have thought. But then it's too early in the day to really know how things will pan out over the next few months.
All right. Mr. Tilak, if I can come to you, how do you look at this development, this formation of this council, which will have political leaders, the opposition members. How significant you think this step is going to be?
I think it is definitely significant for two reasons. First, you had the Moscow process a little while ago, where a lot of people from the opposition went, and that was a clear signal of showing how deep the differences were in Afghan society, in Afghan government. And I think the government, President Ghani's government, realized that they can easily be manipulated by the Taliban and Pakistan if they continue with these differences, people going on their own with parallel peace processes. So setting up this consultative body, I think, is a very important step. He is trying to reach out to the opposition and other people in Afghan to have a united front, because unless and until there is Afghan unity, they will not be able to deal with or negotiate with the Taliban if it comes down to negotiation. That's still a far way off. Secondly, as Mr. Shakti Sinha mentioned very rightly, this next round of talks with Qatar is also the Taliban are playing the same game.
Yes.
They're inviting individual Afghans to come. And I think one of the statements they used was anybody who's not part of the invading force. So anybody who's associated with the government will not be asked to come to these talks. Now let's see if the Afghan opposition or individual Afghans rise to the bait and go and attend the talks, or they try and present a united front. So I think the step taken by President Ghani is important. We'll just have to wait and see how it sort of develops and how the Taliban and Pakistan will react to this.
But even if you assume that there are talks held, there are Afghan government officials involved, there is a huge lack of trust really between, of course, the Taliban and the government, Afghan government, because so far Afghan government actually has criticized, any move by political groups to engage with the Taliban, because giving the insurgents as unwarranted legitimacy. That is what they have said. And Taliban, of course, have refused directly to meet with the representatives of the Afghan government, saying that it is a puppet of the United States. So lack of trust is clearly there. So even if you assume that these two sides do come together, they do hold talks, do you think they'll be able to, remove that trust deficit really that exists between the two sides?
More than a trust deficit, it's a question of an ideological difference. The Taliban don't accept the constitutionally elected government in Kabul to be a legitimate government.
Yes.
They think it's a puppet government, it's an illegitimate government, and they have nothing to do with the government. So question of trust is, I think, a minor issue. The first is the matter of principle, that if you don't accept the other side, that you're going to negotiate with them. Their stand today is, let the Americans leave and they will take care of the problems with intra-Afghan themselves, which means, it's clearly that they're going to be involved in fighting. So it's much more than a question of trust. So as I mentioned, negotiations are still very far off. I don't see the Taliban at this state, the way they are now, accepting any person from the government as a legitimate representative of Kabul. They will talk to individuals Afghans, try and split, create wider spaces between the Ghani government and the rest of the opposition, and try and manipulate that process.
Ambassador Kaju, if I could ask you, what is going to be the role of America? Because, of course, America is so far dealing with the Taliban, and, of course, the two sides have almost reached an agreement as far as withdrawal of American troops from Afghanistan is concerned. And also Taliban saying, they'll not let the Afghan soil to be used by the terrorists. This is what the agreement they have reached. And US says that it has actually welcomed, the formation of this council. But do you think US would be actually ready to cede all the negotiating power that it has been having with the Taliban?
Look, the starting point is that the Americans under Trump want to leave.
Yes.
That is their first point. For this purpose, they've eaten humble pie. They've almost admitted a strategic defeat, certainly a strategic retreat. And they are negotiating with the Taliban something that they had earlier said they would not do.
Yes.
They were urging that the Taliban should negotiate with the Afghan government.
Yes, they haven't said.
They've given the Taliban complete legitimacy. Today, the Taliban are welcome almost all over the world. Everyone is talking to them. Now, as you rightly said, from the American viewpoint, the primary objective was to ensure that another Al-Qaeda base in Afghanistan or an ISIS base, which is there somewhat, is not formed. So that the American mainland or American interests can't be hurt from Afghan territory. This the Taliban seem to have given them. Let us not also forget that the Americans had never had problems with the Taliban per se. Their problems arose because the Taliban were giving shelter to Al-Qaeda. So today the Americans are telling the Taliban that this is what you are giving us, that's fine. Now, two other points. In 1989, once the Soviets left Afghanistan, the Americans just upped and left. And there was absolute chaos in Afghanistan 3 years after the Soviet withdrawal. Because Najibullah's government collapsed, the Mujahideen came, they couldn't agree, then the Taliban came. The Americans don't want that situation to come again. But they've conceded such space to the Taliban, and also militarily they've not been able to defeat the Taliban. In fact, they are, as I've said, suffering a strategic defeat, and the reason for that is that they've not been willing to get into Pakistan, where the sanctuaries are, despite all the chest thumping by Trump initially in August of 2017. So today, I think the Americans are in a bit of a quandary, and the Taliban are playing very hard ball. They are telling the Americans that, look, we are the main people in Afghanistan. The Kabul authorities are your puppets. And once you leave, then it is for us to decide. And that is the game that they are playing by inviting everyone else in their individual or group capacities to come to Qatar. So another chapter, they are trying to open another chapter, and we'll just have to wait and watch what happens now. My only fear is that many Afghan parties and individuals will seriously bite at the Taliban bait because they seem to be the winning side. And in any situation like this, the winning side creates a certain momentum.
And sir, Mr. Sinha, if I could ask you, the developments in Afghanistan, of course, we have seen they do affect the relations between America and Russia as well. With these developments panning out, how do you think this will change or alter or affect in Russia-US relations?
Actually, in far as Russia and US are concerned, at this moment, both of them are on the same plane, absolutely. In fact, Russia opened up to Taliban before the Americans did. And they said, yes, for legitimate security reasons, we shall talk to them. They hosted them, and there are various meetings. Now the Americans are doing the same. So in that sense, Americans, by withdrawing from Afghanistan, are conceding that we will not be interested in this part of the world, other than that Afghanistan and its neighbors should not host a sanctuary for anybody to attack them. That is something which the Russians are perfectly fine with. What we should be more worried, and that is where India is for us it's so important, what will happen to our neighborhood and what will happen to us. Because when the Americans have asked the Taliban to give an assurance about not hosting groups to attack them, the Taliban have refused to name any group. They have given a general assurance. Could it be possible that groups not hostile to America, but groups interested in working in India or in a neighborhood could be there? These are issues that is going to come out as the discussions, as the negotiations between the Taliban and the Americans move on to the next step. And that is something which obviously we have to watch very, very carefully.
Absolutely. And you mentioned neighborhoods. Mr. Tilak, if I could ask you, what role is Pakistan actually going to play in this peace process is very, very significant, because we saw the US envoy, of course, traveling to Pakistan and speaking to the leadership there. And in fact, there are also reports that he met with the army chief as well. Pakistan really, what role could Pakistan play in this entire scenario? Because Pakistan, of course, takes the credit for holding talks between the US and the Taliban. And but of course, the US officials have been accusing, and of course, the Afghan government have been accusing Pakistan of sheltering Taliban leaders, as we just mentioned. So what Pakistan's role is going to be if we see this development, going further, these talks going further?
Pakistan says a critical role because it can really act as spoilers. It will ensure the pace, it will dictate the pace at which any kind of negotiations are held, either with the US or the kind of negotiations which are held with the Afghan groups. You would recall that in 2015, when this Murray process, as it was called at that time, was started, that time the Taliban had talked to the Afghan officials in Murray. Then Mullah Omar's death was announced and the whole thing came off. But this time when the talks have restarted, The Taliban have refused to talk to anyone from Afghanistan. Obviously, the whole process is being calibrated by Pakistan. So Pakistan will see and dictate the pace and the manner in which any kind of negotiations are held, and to see what benefit it can derive for itself, for its larger game that it has in the neighborhood. And I think India figures very prominently in that larger game that Pakistan is planning to hold, and will use Afghanistan as some sort of a strategic backup as far as the game in India is concerned. So to come back to your question, Pakistan has a very critical role to play in how this whole thing pans out.
Ambassador Kaju, if I could ask you your viewpoint on this, because Pakistan's links with the Taliban have also been at the center of really the tension between with the Ghani government as well. Under these circumstances, and how pivotal role really Pakistan is playing in this case, what role can India possibly have?
Look, Pakistan has a very negative role. They are trying to really determine how the situation unfolds in Afghanistan, and their first interest is naturally to safeguard and promote their own interests, which are not the interests of Afghanistan or the region. As far as I can see, the Pakistanis have no interest in maintaining the integrity of the Kabul government, of Ashraf Ghani's government. If anything, they are saying repeatedly, and it's a point of friction between Ashraf Ghani and Imran Khan and the Pakistan army.
Yes.
Because the Pakistanis are calling for an interim government. That means that there is a process, the Kabul authorities are not in charge, there is some interim authority, and that would mean almost going back to 2001 or early 2002. Once the Taliban were ousted from Kabul and is setting the clock back. That there is a great danger, because if all that transpires, then the political cohesion in Afghanistan might break.
Yes.
And if that happens, then the army itself might splinter. That has been the historical experience, and that would be bad for the region. As far as we are concerned, let us be realistic. Our role on the ground there is limited.
Yes.
India enjoys great popularity, and that will continue. The vast sections of Afghan people want a good relationship with India, and I, for one, am convinced that except for a brief period, anyone who may come in Kabul, any authority that may come in Kabul, will ultimately have good ties with us. That is the dictates of geography, and history bears that out. But the interim period will be difficult for us. So, I, for one, have been advocating we should see the writing on the wall, and we should have contacts with the Taliban, even while we maintain and strengthen our ties with the Kabul government. I think these are not incompatible. That is the way the diplomatic game is played always, and that is the way we should play it, to my mind.
Right. And Mr. Sinha, the Afghan government itself here, because if you look at this council that is made, of course, there are opposition parties also there. But, you know, the fact of the matter is that council itself may be very fragile, you know, because we see that Mr. Ghani's office still has a lot of differences with the other political parties, the politicians there. For example, if you look at how seriously is the Afghan government really looking at the participation of women, if you look at the list of negotiators that the Afghan government has proposed, it only has 2 women on the list. So, though of course they have welcomed the formation of this council, they are saying that it is a very significant step, but itself the stability of this council is also going to be very significant, isn't it?
Absolutely. You know, the Afghan, as Mr. Kaju has all mentioned, the Afghan political system is a deeply fragmented one, and therefore it is difficult. So individuals have attended meetings with the Taliban in Moscow, have contacted Taliban separately, and therefore for them to come to a common understanding is not going to be easy. The role of the women is more critical. In fact, a lot of Afghan women had objected very strongly to the fact that they may lose all their rights. And Ambassador Khalilzad in Kabul had to meet with groups of Afghan women to reassure them that their needs will be looked after, that their interests will be protected. Even the Taliban have made some kind of sounds that we will defend the rights of the women within the overall Quranic system,
Yes.
the Sharia. So, which is actually neither here nor there, because the actual reporting which came out, say, from one of the provinces, Nuristan, is that one woman was being beaten in public because she was listening to the radio, listening to music. So, you know, on one hand, you have the tensions role of the women. On the other hand, within the Afghan polity of Ghani, you have others. So, obviously, for them to come to a common understanding and how to go ahead, especially when the other sides don't seem to be supporting them at this moment of time, it's not an easy task for them.
Absolutely.
It's not an easy task.
And this leads us to the further question, Mr. Sinha, if I can ask you, that, you know, there is a huge at stake as far as this council is concerned now. All eyes are on how successful this council is going to be. So, of course, it's a hypothetical question, but what if it fails, you know? What if it is not able to, you know, reach at conclusions, it is not able to talk to the Taliban and negotiate with them? In that case, of course, it will rather be counterproductive, because it will rather damage people's trust in the government, and it will show that government is weak and it is marginalized.
There are various aspects of the question you've raised, very important question. One is the government's credibility and the legitimacy. The Afghan government's legitimacy is very much there by the people. Credibility and its ability to provide security to the people is not there. So I don't think they'll be too worried now that the government can lose further credibility. What is more difficult is once you remove a legal authority, and if you don't replace it by something which is equally legal in the eyes of the people, you're going to only create more instability, even if that authority has the powers. So therefore, whether this council does well or not, I'm not so worried, as the fact that the two key questions of the Afghan talks, which is ceasefire and what's going to happen afterwards, the interim government or whatever arrangements, how do you co-opt the Taliban into the system? Those are the issues which as of now are not being talked about, and ultimately these two issues have to be decided before you can really move towards peace in Afghanistan.
Mr. Tilak, and how much can the Taliban be trusted? Because, you know, we have seen that the talks have been going on for very long, and despite those talks, the Taliban are staging, you know, attacks almost every day, and of course they are inflicting staggering casualties, and they are also holding sway over almost half of the area in the country. How much can we actually trust them, even if the peace process actually goes ahead?
You know, the fact of the matter is that there has been no change in the Taliban ideology at all. You know, they continue to maintain what they maintained in the 90s. They don't accept the constitution, they don't accept democracy, they don't accept elections. So there is no change in the Taliban ideology. In fact, even during these talks with the US, all they are saying is the American foreign troops should leave Afghanistan and they will take care of the rest.
Yes.
Which clearly means they still believe in Amirul Momineen. They don't accept a presidential form of government. They don't accept all that has been achieved in Afghanistan in 18 years. So Taliban cannot be trusted. In fact, this whole, according to me, maybe slightly harsh, but this whole peace process itself is actually a myth, because the Taliban are, one's party is approaching this entire thing by not accepting the basic rules of engagement on the ground. You know, so what are the people? It's basically the US wanting to go out and have created this myth of a peace process. Actually, it's an exit process. It's an exit strategy for the US to move out of Afghanistan and cut their losses and leave. What happens now, of course, they realize that they can't leave like they did in the early 1990s. You know, what happens to the constitution, what are the investments they have done, and they would like to leave some troops behind, have some bases over there. So it is a bit of a quandary. It is a very difficult situation. But as far as to your question, if the Taliban, can you trust the Taliban? Certainly not. I don't think so you can trust the Taliban. And more than that, I would not trust Pakistan at all to be able to say that Pakistan is going to allow peace in Afghanistan that is not on their terms, which means that they don't have a puppet regime in Kabul. Though whether the Taliban will be puppets, that's a different story altogether.
Whether they will allow Taliban to function at all independently, that is the absolute.
Yeah. Master Kaju, I think you'd like to
add. I think the Afghans have a tradition of ultimately functioning independently. That's my experience. That's one. Let's face it, the Taliban have not been defeated. Militarily, they've survived everything that the Americans could throw at them.
Yes.
And that is because the Americans refused to cross the Durand line and go and clean up the mess in Pakistan. For whatever reason. And now they have an impossible situation. Either they continue this endless war, which they don't. Trump says that I'm fed up, I want to leave.
Yes.
There's a mess. And Khalilzad has an impossible task of trying to make something out of that mess. And the Taliban are not cooperating. Why should they? They think they've won.
Yes.
Absolutely. They're saying that we defeated the Afghan opposition, defeated the Soviet, one superpower. We are in the process of defeating the other. So this game is being played. As far as we are concerned, we've got to be very, very watchful. And in this situation, I think our diplomacy requires a certain deftness and nimbleness. And that means contacts with all sides, including the Taliban.
Absolutely.
All right. Indeed, after months of bitter disagreements over the next steps for peace talks with the Taliban, there seems to be some movement. The government has announced the formation of this council that will talk to the Taliban. Of course, the Afghan government had been so far left out of the country's peace process. And now a first step really has been taken, but we have to wait and watch how the Taliban responds and how the talks really pan out in the days to come. That's all in this edition of India's World. I would like to thank our guests on the show. I would like to thank Mr. Tilak Deveshwar, Mr. Shakti Sinha, and of course Mr. Vivek Kaju. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us and sharing your perspective and your analysis on Afghan peace process. Thank you so much, gentlemen. And also, I would like to tell our viewers that we look forward to your suggestions. Mail us your feedback and suggestions on indiasworld.feedback@gmail.com. You can also tweet us your responses. Our Twitter handle is @Rajya Sabha TV. And that's all in this program from me, Aishwarya Kapoor. Thanks so much for your time.